Section 12.3 has to do with blood vessels. I know we've already talked a little bit about blood vessels. We knew that an artery always carries blood away from the heart. And I know that you know that a vein always carries blood to the heart. Capillary then is that was when we were using the purple color to talk about what was happening at the capillary bed. We call that gaseous exchange. That's where oxygen is going to leave the blood vessels and go into the tissues, and CO2 from the tissues will go back into the blood vessel to be carried away to the lungs. In addition, we can see the diffusion of nutrients out of the red blood at the purple capillary beds. We can see the diffusion of medicines, and we can see the uptake of other types of tissue waste at the purple capillary beds, which would then be carried away in a vein. What I probably haven't told you yet is that when an artery begins to branch at the capillary bed, these smaller ones that are still carrying red blood are called arterioles. And those that will eventually form into a thicker vein are called venules. So we can see that down here in this diagram, we can see an artery shown here. We can see an arteriole where it's beginning to branch. We can see the purple capillary bed where we see gaseous exchange and the removal of nutrients and other things into the tissue walls, and then the uptake of waste and carbon dioxide in the purple capillary beds, which will be carried through a venule, which will eventually extend back out as a vein and run back to the heart. Something important to know about arteries and veins is that they are made up of 3 layers. The very outside layer of both this artery and what's shown in blue here with the vein is called the tunica externa. It's just connective tissue. The next layer is super important. That's the tunica media, and that's going to be the involuntary smooth muscle. In an artery, it's very thick. You can see it here. In a vein, there's much less of it. You can see it in red. And the arteries have more smooth muscle because they have to be able to stretch with the pulse. So every time the left ventricle is pumping out blood through the aorta, you can feel that as your pulse, and you have to be able to stretch the walls of the arteries to be able to deal with that pressure. By the time the blood comes through the capillary beds and comes out of the veins have very low blood pressure, if any at all. So there are valves that are found in veins, and those valves keep blood, especially in the bottom half of your body, from going back down into your feet. So every time you move, these veins are embedded in your muscles, and every time you move, your muscles will squeeze the blood up back to the heart against the pull of gravity. And if you stop moving, that valve will catch that blood in that particular area of the vein and keep it from going back down into your feet. And so if you have a failure of the valve, that's what it's a varicose vein. So if you've ever seen spider veins in somebody's legs, excuse me. Another interesting feature that we can see here are precapillary sphincters, and they can actually cause the blood flow to the capillary bed to temporarily be discontinued. And that would happen like right after you're done eating a big meal. You're probably going to want to open up the blood vessels around your intestines, but then you're probably going to want to close off the blood vessels to your major muscles as you're digesting. And so when you think of rest and digest as controlled by the autonomic nervous system, then as you're digesting and opening up these sphincters to increase blood flow around your digestive organs, you're probably going to close them off at the muscles because you're resting while you're digesting. Remember that blood vessels can open and close involuntarily. We call that vasodilation and vasoconstriction. That's one word, vasodilation. And that would be when your blood vessels would open. So if you were outside on a hot day and you were exercising, and your blood is going to come to the surface of your body, and you're going to look red and flushed, that's vasodilation. On a cold day, if you're standing outside, vasoconstriction. On a cold day, if you were watching a parade and you were outside for a long time, and you look at your friend and you say, your lips are purple, that's vasoconstriction. So that's where the blood has pulled from the surface of the body and in order to conserve body heat in deeper into the body. So that is 12.3. For 12.4, let's talk a little bit about circulation. And let's start with the pulse. So the pulse is the alternating expansion and recoil of the arterial walls, and that's because they have that thick tunica media. I think I failed to talk about the tunica intima. That's the very, very inside layer of a blood vessel that would be closest to the lumen. So if we come back over here, we can feel the pulse at different pulse points. I like to take it at the wrist, which is the radial artery. A lot of you I've seen in workouts or in practice like to take it at the neck, at the common carotid. Those are two of the most well-known. Brachial artery is where we're going to take blood pressure with a cuff. And so we're going to use the brachial artery, but you can also feel a pulse at the femoral artery and on the top of the foot. Remember that your pulse should be about 60 to 100 beats per minute to be healthy. That's beats per minute. And so every time your left ventricle pushes blood through the artery, remember it comes out kind of in a tsunami. It doesn't come out like the water would come out of the faucet if you turned it on in just a constant steady stream. That's not how your blood is pushed out of your heart. It's pushed out in waves. And so it's that pulse that we can feel at the common carotid or radial at about 60 to 100 beats per minute. If you're going to put a cuff on, that's called a sphygmomanometer. And a sphygmomanometer is a blood pressure cuff that is placed across the brachial artery. And the whole idea is that the person who's taking your blood pressure is going to use this rubber cuff and inflate the portion that's over your arm. And the whole idea is that the amount of air you push into the cuff is going to override the natural blood pressure, and it's going to temporarily cut off the blood flow to the arm, and that's going to tingle. So I'm sure you'd experience that when having your blood pressure taken. And then the person who's taking your blood pressure will slowly release the pressure at this little nozzle. And as the blood pressure within the artery exceeds and takes over what currently is being measured on the measuring device, then you will begin to feel the blood come back through. And we want to take two different measurements when it comes to your blood pressure. We want to take the systolic blood pressure over the diastolic blood pressure. And the systolic blood pressure is the amount of energy that's being exerted on the walls of an artery as the left ventricle is contracting. And on a device, a normal, healthy systolic blood pressure would be about 120 millimeters of mercury over 80 millimeters of mercury. And the diastolic pressure then is the artery at rest because the left ventricle is at rest. And so you do not want high blood pressure, you do not want low blood pressure. High blood pressure is hypertension, and about 33% of Americans suffer from hypertension, which can lead to stroke and heart attack. Anybody registering a blood pressure of 140 over 90 or higher is considered to be suffering from hypertension. Too low is hypotension. That's going to lead you to a sensation or feeling lightheaded or passing out. You don't want that. You want the perfect range, and that's going to be that value right there. When we look at some of the major blood vessels in the body, I think you're going to be familiar with quite a number of them. You've got the external and internal jugular veins, which eventually are going to lead to the superior vena cava. You also know you've got an inferior vena cava. Some of the major arteries on the upper portion of the body would be the interior carotid and exterior carotid, which are going to branch off the aorta. You also know that the aorta is the largest artery. The brachial artery is the one we're going to take blood pressure from a sphygmomanometer. The radial artery is the one that I prefer to use for taking my pulse. But you also have the descending aorta, which they have not labeled here. So I'll do that for you. Right here is the descending aorta. And that is also an artery, which is going to lead to the femoral artery. And whenever you see a major artery, you're going to see a major vein associated with it nearby. It's kind of like when you think about I-65, you've got I-65 north, then you have a median, and you have I-65 south, and they're moving in different directions. It's the same way with the arterial and venous system of the body. Whenever you have a femoral artery, you're probably going to have a femoral vein right next to it. And so those are some of the major ones that we've already talked about already. I think I told you that I would share with you this famous picture from the Boston Marathon bombing. This guy was nicknamed Cowboy. And if you can see the person that is being wheeled in the wheelchair was close to the blast, you can see that has very little color in his face. And that's because that guy, if you look down in his right hand, is holding his femoral artery closed because the bottom portion of his leg is missing. And so you can see the size and diameter of the femoral artery. Had he not done that, this guy would have easily have bled out. Every time his left ventricle pumped, then there would have just been a blast of blood that would be squirting out of that femoral artery had he not grabbed it. So that guy ended up surviving. So that's the end of this chapter, and test will be around the corner.